Mitchell and Kenyon shot reams of film of ordinary people in the early Edwardian urban landscape. Usually commissioned by travelling showmen, local people were invited to a special showing, a chance to see themselves up there on the big screen for a trifling entrance fee, of course.
Mitchell and Kenyon as cinematographers had an extraordinary lifestyle. They'd go around places, mostly cities, film as many people as they could, and then presumably they were either telling the people or they were handing out leaflets. And later that night, the people they'd filmed could come to the fairground and for a modest admission fee could see themselves up on screen. This must have been a form of magic at the turn of the 20th century. People could be filmed coming out of work, go home, have a wash, grab the wife and children or whatever, into the fairgrounds. Look, that's me up on screen. It must have been an amazing experience.
After the company closed in 1913, most of the stock was presumed lost. Remarkably, 800 reels of Mitchell and Kenyon film came to light in a Blackburn basement in 1995. The footage, shot in and about Cork between 1901 and 1903, tells a story that sits uncomfortably with the politics of independence, a story that has remained largely untold ever since.
The power of the subsequent events must have been such that they remodelled what was happening and what we see in this film. They swept away that early 20th century British city with its Union Jacks and its passers-by.
Some 15 years before the Easter Rising, Mitchell and Kenyon recorded an altogether different Cork city to that of the martyred Lord Mayors Terence MacSweeney and Thomas McCurtain.
The reality was, I think, that there was a colossal amount of sheer acceptance of the prosperity that existed in a rather smug but very well provided for city in many ways.
This is not the city that traditionally Cork people would have learned about either in school or from their grandparents or from history books, but it was there, it is a reality.
An evocation of ghosts teasing through the lens of Sagar Mitchell and James Kenyon atop the King Street tram in 1902. King, soon to be renamed McCurtain Street, in memory of a murdered Lord Mayor.
The story of the War of Independence, which was so much part of the story Cork tells itself about itself in my lifetime, we forget that over and against this uprising of the clerks and school teachers and factory workers and post office workers, there was a very strongly established and very prosperous and very fashionable middle class.
Looking at this very English-looking city with people dressed really like Edwardian, late Edwardian England, women with their wonderful hats, men in bowler hats and so on, it certainly challenged my idea of an Irish city at the start of the 20th century. And it is indistinguishable, I would think, from any British city, any provincial British city. You begin to wonder very fast, well, where did the Cork that possibly people of my generation grew up with, well, where did that come from?
Could this young cyclist have grown up to become a martyred Lord Mayor? Or could his bones lie scattered among the anonymous dead at Suvla Bay or Sudelbar? Over whose shop did that Union Jack flutter? Does it matter? Did it matter then?
There's a very obvious and striking appearance of the Union Jack, which shocks us nowadays as being a sort of imperialist thing. Such manifestations of British rule were accepted and it caused very little shock.
Now Collins, then Victoria Barracks. And the Munster Fusiliers, just back from the Boer War, are cheered home to a man by Shawleys and street urchins alike.
Watching that raggle-taggle army straggling out of Victoria Barracks, as it was, it reminded me that in the late 70s I had a flat directly across from the officers' mess, aptly called, in Collins Barracks, as it had become. And there was an old woman there, very genteel, Dots was her name. She wouldn't go into the pub on her own, so she'd grab you in the shop and say, will you accompany me into the pub? And then, of course, you'd buy her a drink. But then she was in then, but she had been brought in by a gentleman. I was passing for a gentleman in those days. But Dots's attitude was, this was always a very loyal city. And she meant loyal to the British Empire. She'd never reconciled herself to the idea of independence whatsoever. She hankered after the soldiery.
I'd never marry a soldier, a sailor or a marine, but keep your eye on the Sinn Féin Bible is yellow, white and green. So right away, so right away, so right away, Salonica, right away, me soldier boy.
20 years after this film was shot, the Union Jack was the butcher's apron. It was a symbol of revulsion, it was a symbol of an impediment to statehood. At the time, it was just the flag of the ruling power. It was just the flag of them, the ones who run things. You look at that launch coming down the River Lee by the exhibition grounds and you think, yeah, well, it's a colourful flag. It's a decoration. 20 years later, to go down the River Lee with a Union Jack flying off a flag, you'd need an escort of black and tans on both sides of the river. So in such a short time, such an enormous change can happen.
Do my thoughts in their fancy take flight to the home of my childhood away?
If you look at many of the main streets now and compare them to the representation that you get of them in this film, I would have to say that Cork looked more elegant and the streetscapes were less broken. There's a kind of fluidity and there's a language in the streetscapes, in the buildings, in the shops and so on, that we have lost.
I see my grandfather's face, the face of his friends. I see them as young men, my grandmother, my aunts, my own parents. I see their faces as children or as teenagers or as young adults or as elderly people all over these films, because there is a kind of a stock of faces that comes back, just as there's a stock of stories.
Grand Parade meets Washington Street at Singer's Corner, ever a lively hub of activity.
It was, of course, a very noisy city. There's certainly bustling and full of every kind of transport life. And in a sense, I think we can truly say, far more efficiently provided with public transport than we are today.
Nobody now alive could have been in any of those films. We are looking at the dead. But they were bustling about their lives. They weren't overcome by melancholy at the thought that they were mortal. They lived their lives with a kind of an open freedom.
There's a tram and a cart, I think, for example, which is a lovely kind of natural juxtaposition of two things, which gives extraordinary life to a street scene. The horse determined to go his own way, and the tram kind of having to deal with this. It's a wonderfully living moment that they have caused. And there are many of these, I think, that scatter throughout.
There's a wonderful scene of people coming out of the Lee Boot Company or Dwyer's or the Hanover, as it would have been called in Cork traditionally. These are names that have very, very strong resonances for anybody from Cork. But the crowd of people really pouring out at the end of a day's work, presumably the bell went off, they could all rush out and go home. And you have all social classes. You have people who are clearly workers. You have children who are workers. If you look at them and just say to yourself, how old are they? They look like 8, 9, 10-year-old children, members of the adult world already.
The great range of age. You have the youngsters, the young workers, the apprentices. It was an age, of course, of apprenticeship. And the more senior workers.
So you have child workers, you have adult workers, and then you have people in bowler hats who must have been foremen who must have been maybe the directors, and there's at least one woman looking extremely elegant, and all of this together, a small world, but really the whole world.
I was very struck by the independence-mindedness of the odd character that you'd see in a film, spotting a camera. He struts across, the real, here's me. Do you know, there's a Cork type, like, you know, here's me. And this fellow walking out of the lee boot, for instance, and he's fixing the hard hat, you know. Now, he hasn't a clue what he looks like. He's never seen himself, but he's very keen on presenting the right image of himself, like, you know. And you look at him and say, this boy is up for anything.
Far from the world of factory workers, polite society drifts down from the laundered suburbs of Sunday's Well. Echoes of drawing room soirees about them, and an assured sense of their place in an ordered world.
There's a bower of roses by Bendemeer stream, and the nightingale sings round it all the day long. In the time of my childhood, 'twas like a sweet dream to sit in the roses and hear the bird song.
Merchant Prince Cork knew how to promenade, among the right kind of people, of course.
Forget, but oh, when alone in the bloom of the year, I think is the nightingale singing there yet? Are the roses still bright by the calm Bendemeer?
Where better to capture Cork people at their best than after Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's Church on the Lower Road.
Faith of our fathers living still, in spite of dungeon, fire and sword.
You look at the people coming out of St. Patrick's, and they walk out, they hang around on the steps, they talk to each other, some go off to buy the paper.
Everyone then, of course, looking their best and also proud to be doing their religious duties and to be seen and photographed doing them as well. So that not only did you do good, but you were seen to do good.
Respectable as St. Patrick's was, and indeed remains, a certain aura attaches to St. Mary's Pope's Quay that suggests it caters for a particularly refined congregation.
Outside St. Mary's, people have their little carriages with their drivers, waiting for presumably to sweep them up into Shanakeel and Sunday as well. So even an innocent image, like here are people coming out of churches, it's not here are two congregations coming out of Catholic churches. Part of the social stratification of the city is laid bare. I'm sure they took a much better collection in St. Mary's.
The Cork and Muskerry Light Railway, serving Dunamore, Blarney, Coachford and Cork, has all but fallen out of folk memory. Mitchell and Kenyon's long-lost footage breathes new life into a dying legend.
I'm always amazed when I think of the transport situation because I was familiar with it at a sort of later stage when it survived really into the 30s. But Cork had so many railway stations, about 5 of them. It had a vast amount of horse traffic. You had the sound of the trams, the whining, the banging. You had then the rattle where I was at school. You had the rattle of the Muskerry dasher across the way at certain hours of the day.
If the Muskerry Dasher is nigh forgotten, the Muskerry Sportsman lives on.
Rambling for football and sporting, for drinking back.
Signs of black porter perhaps in the demeanour of the jolly chap on the left.
Scoven you'll find them so jovial as the Muscovy sportsman of old Teddy Quill. At the Cork exhibition there was a fair lady whose fortune exceeded $1 million or more.
Whatever about Thady Quill attending the Cork International Exhibition in 1902, Mitchell and Kenyon certainly did. A vast hymn to native industry, science and agriculture. Nothing on this scale has ever been attempted before or since on the banks of the Lee. The Irish wonder of the empire, the Cork exhibition was the brainchild of a much-loved Lord Mayor, Alderman Edward Fitzgerald.
There were great jokes, for example, about the Lord Mayor at the great exhibition, Fitzy, as he was known locally. But he was a very homely man, like, you know, he used to tell stories like that he was alleged to have addressed the Queen like, ate up your dinner, ma'am, no, you know.
Mitchell and Kenyon were in their element.
They're very interested in Cork people's interest in the public space. And they show a city where people seem to stand around a lot of the time, gawking at each other, and where they get a great sense of fun.
The international exhibition attracted peers of the realm, captains of industry, and the as yet largely loyal citizenry of Cork.
There's very much a sense of spectacle of people dressing themselves in order to show off, and the public space being used as a kind of stage, as a theatre, where people would perform, even if the performance meant simply walking up and down.
Cork society welcomed both the Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in Ireland, the Duke of Connaught, and a royal entourage led by Prince Henry of Prussia, visiting the exhibition in early summer 1902.
People who are also very conscious, middle class, who are very conscious of their status and of having arrived, and who are part of the kind of a royal setup in a sense, and would be turning out in their best on all these great public occasions to meet whoever was to be met, and preferably to be photographed doing so as well, as a mark of their arrival and of their status. So Cork had very much that kind of, I think, very self-satisfied social consciousness of achieved worth and achieved gentility.
That you loved me still the same, that you loved me still the same, that you loved.
Cork turned out in 1902 with the same enthusiasm for the symbols of empire it was later to display when welcoming such pillars of the Republic as W.T. Cosgrave and Eamon de Valera. Perhaps the most remarkable images filmed by Mitchell and Kenyon in Cork form a sequence which records the grand procession that marked the opening of the Great Exhibition in 1902. This arguably marks the high point of Edwardian film in Ireland as social and civic archaeology.
I often think of home beyond the air, when I am all alone and far away.
Anyone who was free at all headed off the minute there was a bit of excitement. But of course then, in some of these clips, we see the big formal, I think, procession with landaus and all the best people in their best attire and their tall hats. But I think they all turned out, you know, the trade unions with their big formal painted banners.
I mean, look at the doubting, quizzical expressions on the face of the factory workers, and look at the complacent faces of the Cork merchants and the aldermen and their ladies as they're driven by in carriages to be looked at.
I'm not never taught me
The camera picks out all faces equally. We all know how to present ourselves to a camera. In those days, it's as if those in power already knew how to present themselves. The poor were still dubious, though. What's this yoke? Who's this now taking advantage of me?
People, I think, had in Cork this a rather proud sense of occasion, and the march out to the great exhibition opening must certainly have been quite something to see.
There's one or two banners with the Irish language in them, and there it's still quaint, it's still touristic. 20 years later, a banner with a script in the Irish language is saying something entirely different. So these literally are signs and signifiers of who people were, but you can see the embryos of change to come.
It was the city, as it were, en fête. They were all out. They were there, they were entitled to be there, and they were going to have a damn good day.
When we look back at our own place, you know, the place of our birth, the place that nurtured and shaped us, that gave us our accents, that gave us our ways of breathing, of walking in the street. I go back to Cork and see these same faces, but these faces belong to people who are long since gone. They're gone into dust. It's that curious comfort you get when you actually accept the truth of death as the thing that gives life its meaning. So the film is a kind of challenge to our collective sense of ourselves, and it's a challenge to us to remember how to love our place and how to love each other. Above all else, I think it's a reminder to us that we have to cherish the dead.
What survives of Mitchell and Kenyon's footage of Edwardian Cork was shot for profit, undiluted by political or propaganda imperative. If their cameras strayed into the festering poverty on either side of the river, those pictures have not survived. Nevertheless, these images inform our vision of Cork on the cusp of the 20th century. Waiting in the wings, both kings and kaisers and dreamers with guns would shatter this world forever.
It's like waking up one morning, going through a mirror into a city that at one level is very familiar because we can recognise Anglesey Street and so on and so on. But everything else is different, everything has changed. So there's a kind of a moving backwards and forwards through a mirror that makes it both real and unreal. And for me, this is what makes this film an absolute knockout.
When you look back at a piece of film like this, you are put in touch with the dead, and they are somehow brought back to life because you realise you're just an instant of the human condition. So there's comfort even as there's sorrow there.
And the look of the Irish season continues later tonight with a moving account of the life and early death of a talented young
fruit, and the lives of ordinary people were to be shaped and marked by the forging of a new course in Irish history, the birth and growth of a new Irish state. And so it was that in the early years of this century that one Francis Mary Hegarty Brown, scholar, traveller and Jesuit priest, in the tradition of the early monastic chroniclers, recorded the birth and growth of the independent Ireland, not of course with quill and vellum, but with the illuminating instrument of his own time, the camera. His was a life of incident and adventure, not out of place in the pages of a novel, the life of an adventurer and traveller. He sailed on the Titanic on its ill-fated maiden voyage, intending to come ashore at Queenstown, now Cove. But by then he had befriended the American millionaires, the Odells, who insisted he be their guest on the entire trip to New York. An excited telegram sought permission, but that merely provoked a terse reply from his superior, simply saying, "No, get off that ship." So, one might say, superior wisdom saved his life. He went on to become chaplain to the Irish Guards, surviving the horrors of Passchendaele and Ypres. 5 times he was injured, and he was awarded the Military Cross and the Croix de Guerre, rare honours for a non-combatant. But his lasting fame was to come of his fascination with photography and of the history he captured. As a working priest, he primarily preached in the renewal services known as the missions. But no hellfire from his pulpit, but a gentle soul preaching of a loving God each evening. And that left the day free for his other love, photography. His was the history of the lives of the people, in which showed the success or the failure of strategies which would mould and shape the new independent Serstort Éireann. In an archive of 40,000 images, he recorded the people setting out on a great adventure, the birth of a nation, awaited by idealists and dreamers for 700 years. Momentous events of just the day before yesterday. We had emerged from the terrible beauty of the War of Independence. The Civil War bloodletting within the family was mercifully now at an end too. And now, in this year of our Lord, 1923, we were free of the old enemy and looking forward to the new dawn and to the fruits of freedom. The patriot Pearse himself had drawn the vision of that promised land. A free Ireland could not have hunger in its fertile vales or squalor in her cities. We would drain the bogs, harness the rivers, plant the wastes. We would nationalise the railways, improve agriculture, protect fisheries, foster industry. Workers would be educated, cities beautified. Ireland would govern herself as no external power, nay, not even a government of angels and archangels could govern her. All seemed changed, but was it changed utterly? The new state enthusiastically expunged the marks of Britain's ancient claim here. The crown, which had dominated the aspirations of the harp, had now been painted over, green over red. And on the postman's cap, the harp replaced the crown. The new state had its own livery and trappings to proclaim its own separate identity. The names over many a shopfront took on a Celtic scroll for the first time, while towns and villages here and there delved back into their history to declare themselves not only free, but Gaelic. Names which had curried favour in their time were now to be obliterated. Where now were Kings County or Queens, where Kingstown and Maryborough, gone the way of Queenstown, which of course had become Cove. Gone too was the RIC. Their foes had now become the government, and many of them moved north to join the RUC, and many of them, who had previously fought the police, were now the police themselves, and in the ranks of the new Garda Síochána. Only in Dublin did one superficial echo of the past survive, with the men of the Dublin Metropolitan Police still wearing the cape and the tall hat reminiscent of the London bobby, though that too would pass with the horse and cart from the streets of the city. But there were deeper realities to contend with now. Rhetoric now had to give way to a testing reality. Now that we had our freedom, how would we use it? What would we achieve with it? Everywhere around was the aftermath of years of war and strife at home. Trains had been thrown from their tracks, bridges blown up, buildings levelled. The economy was in tatters when handed over to us by the British. The very air, it was said, was still heavy with the smell of petrol and cordite. So could the soldiers who had suffered and survived all that, as they had wrenched freedom from Britain, now become successful builders of a new state, develop its economy, improve the lot of its people? Could those soldiers fashion their swords into ploughshares and their guns into slide rules? They faced an enormous task. As Pearse had seen it, an independent Ireland would not have hunger or squalid slums, and the fledgling state had inherited the challenge of widespread deprivation amongst its people. The sordid slums of Dublin had often been held up as being the result of British misrule. Now the British were gone, the slums remained, and we had to face the task of tackling them. The Free State had over 750,000 people cramped into overcrowded conditions. It was a breeding ground for disease, and so, in the capital city alone, behind dry statistics, was a terrible tale of misery. 25 children in every 1,000 never reached their 5th birthday. In 1 year, 3,500 people would die from tuberculosis. 8 times that number suffered from the disease. And behind the poet's idealized image of the simple contentment of a rural people living in thatched and whitewashed cottages lay a contradicting reality. True rural life added to the scale of the problem faced by the new state in trying to reorganize and rebuild decent social conditions. That cottage could be home to 11 people, containing birth, death, hope, and despair. And there was an air of menace, even of threat. Peace had not brought the expected full and plenty, but depression and unemployment, made worse as 20,000 men were demobbed from the army to joblessness. The dole was pitifully small, and anyway, it only lasted 6 months. So after that, it was life by the charity of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, with their free food, coal and clothes, or charity from the despised assistance boards, the successors of the infamous Poor Law. Emigration had been held up as a consequence of the heartless policies of an unfeeling British administration. But what now with independence? The country headed for its highest level of emigration in 40 years, as people fled from poverty to America and to the good times of the Roaring Twenties. But depression was to follow them across the Atlantic. So whom did we have amongst our apprentice cabinet who was equal to this mighty challenge? This first independent government of men was not noted for economic expertise. There was little to choose between policy before independence and after. Griffith alone had an economic vision, but he was now dead, and Kevin O'Higgins and his governmental colleagues held that they could not be governed by a dead man's vision. The prospects for success could hardly have been worse. The boom years for industry and agriculture, as they had fed the First World War machine, were now wound down into slump. In the war years, Irish farmers had grown fat on the exports they had sent to feed the British Army. But now the war was over and demand fell. Prices collapsed by about a half, devastating the agricultural economy. Worst still, we had abused Britain's wartime need and sent them poor quality food. But now they had a choice again, and they chose to instead buy Danish and New Zealand foods, rather than suffer what was then seen as poor Irish quality. And hampering even that smaller remaining British market, a 6 weeks dock strike had broken out in Dublin, cutting exports by a staggering 60%. On top of all that, even the weather went against us, with gloomy, sunless summers reducing crops. And the other arm of the economy, industry, was hardly any better positioned. In a 30 miles radius of any small town in Ireland, there might be a creamery or perhaps a bacon processor. Otherwise, there were merely small workshops repairing farm equipment or supplying timber products to the local market. True, we had the breweries, the distilleries, and the biscuit makers, as well as the woolen mills. But those aside, industry was sparse and weak. The assumption that national wealth and health would somehow flow from independence of itself had proven naive. Pearse's vision of rich agriculture, busy industry, educated workers and beautified cities had run headlong into the challenge of economic recession and international competition. The economy out of which they had hoped to build a new nation was a shambles when Britain had handed it over. And in the face of people's eager expectations of a better life with independence, the young government found itself strapped for money. The holy writ of economic life everywhere was to balance the budget. Aware that many were waiting for the Irish to trip and show they couldn't, after all, handle their own affairs, this young government was determined that it too would be stable and would balance its budget. The result was that far from delivering the promised land, what the people saw was their first government cutting the wages of county council workers, partly because big farmers wanted to be able to cut farm labour wages. They even took back a shilling from the old age pension, and that meant a 10% cut. In the face of the great expectation of a better life with independence, the Dublin Corporation Board of Assistants was abolished. It was spending too much on feeding and clothing the unemployed. And the Minister for Industry and Commerce of the time confidently told his critics that though people might die of starvation, it was not the duty of a government to provide employment. Some of the unemployed might have gone to Australia. There was an invitation from the Australian government to give assisted passage, but the Irish government said no. That might be seen as an admission of defeat. We wanted international economic respectability, and in seeking it, the country achieved not just stability, but stagnation. To many, it was a time of disillusionment, as it became clear that we had not had a revolution to face the question of the use of wealth and the development of the economy. The great question of the ownership of the source of Irish wealth, the land, had been resolved with peasant proprietorship after the land agitation of the 1880s and 1890s. Those who now owned the land and the shops and businesses it supplied didn't want upheaval. It was a case of business as usual. So some continued to travel first class. After all, they still owned the railways. The same people still owned the major industries and the banks. These were the banks with fine nationalistic titles like the Bank of Ireland, the Hibernian, the Munster and Leinster, even the National Bank set up by Daniel O'Connell himself. But now it too, with the others, refused to loan money to the new state to help it develop, until they were prevailed upon to do so by the British Treasury. These were the people who might have put their capital into modern industry, but instead they kept their money safe in London and repainted the name of the rail company in Irish. In the big house, once the centre of power and influence, there was apprehension, insecurity. In this new emerging society, was there room for those who didn't fit into a narrow, Gaelic Catholic view of Irishness? That fear provoked the plaintive spectacle of a delegation from the Church of Ireland Synod approaching Michael Collins to respectfully inquire if they were to be permitted to live in Ireland, or if it was desired that they should leave the country. That had followed on 192 Anglo-Irish houses being burnt in just over 1 year up to March in 1923, often by Republicans who saw them as centres of support for the treaty. Whatever the logic, it left the Anglo-Irish feeling vulnerable and threatened. On the one hand, the new Senate was so drawn as to give the Anglo-Irish 17 seats, and proportional representation had been introduced on the insistence of the British to protect our minority. Yet they were soon to feel apart and excluded. So it was that in the Senate, speaking of an anti-divorce law, Yeats lamented the tragedy that within 3 years of independence they should be discussing a measure grossly oppressive to the religious minority. We against whom you have done this thing are no petty people. We are the people of Burke, of Grattan, of Swift, Emmet and Parnell. We have created most of the modern literature in this country, the best of its political intelligence. They were already a depleted people, their young men wiped out on Flanders Field and on the Somme. Now it was the remnants of a tradition which faced the loss of power, the challenge to their tradition and culture. Fearing the worst, many sold up and moved to what they saw as the mainland, where, sadly, they found no natural home either. The big houses were becoming islands of a different tradition in what was now asserting itself as a Gaelic country. Before partition, they had been the quarter of the population with the wealth and influence. Now cut off from the north by the border, they made up only 4% of the Serstot's population. They must have looked with longing eyes to the other side of the border, where their natural confrères of heart and mind were still the ruling class in their corner of the island. Now there were two governments on the island, and they eyed each other across the new border with suspicion, each believing and hoping that the other wouldn't survive intact. The northern government proclaimed its arrival with the building of the vast Stormont Castle as the seat for its parliament, a physical statement of their intended permanent separation. And, they told Dublin, they even wanted their birth certificate records out of Dublin, even if they'd tear them out of the ledgers. Meanwhile, the southern government still presented itself as the custodian of the northern national interest, paying the wages of school teachers who would undertake to opt out of the northern educational system, teachers who refused to even allow northern government inspectors over the threshold of their schools within the north. Mind you, the southern government's relish for the role diminished as the bills came in, and in time they gave it up. It was a fluid time with the two governments vying with each other. Even the border itself was uncertain, with the Commission still debating where the border would in fact settle. The South fully expected to gain Fermanagh, Tyrone and parts of South Armagh and Derry City. In fact, the Commission suggested that only a few slivers of land should go to the south, but a large chunk of Donegal would be ceded to the north. In the face of that, it was thought prudent to forget the whole business, and the 6 counties remained as they had begun. But despite an antagonistic neighbour, despite sceptical businessmen and bankers at home, despite the barrier of international recession, this hopeful youngster of a country was eager to get on with the job of improving the lot of its people by developing its major resource, agriculture, and by nurturing modern new industries. The cry went out, one more sow, one more cow, and one more acre under the plough, as the country rolled up its sleeves and threw itself into the job with gusto. The government set up the Agricultural Credit Corporation to help reform and develop our major resource, farming, to produce quality exports which would get us back into the British market. In industry, those with money were reluctant to risk investing in an unproven fledgling economy, run by men with more idealism than hard business experience. So the state itself was forced to try its hand at building industry. They searched high and low abroad for Irish business talent to do that job, and they found a very few. But amongst that gallant few, Tom McLaughlin, brought back from his job at Siemens to set up the ESB, which would provide the power for all that new industry. And when they could, they distanced themselves from the old enemy, turning instead to the Germans for power technology. The power station at Ardnacrusher was a brave and giant undertaking by any standards, fueling a pride that we were on the move at last. And when the turbines turned for the first time in 1927, the power surged through a spider's web of cables which had been manhandled into position around the country. These were McGilligan's maypoles, as they were scornfully called, after the Minister for Industry and Commerce, Paddy McGilligan, by an opposition which couldn't see how, in a backward little country with Ireland's limited industry, the electricity produced could ever be used. But used it was, and in a few years homes were lit by electricity in cities and towns, and industries were powered by it, and it filled the airwaves with the sound of the new national radio station, 2RM. These brave adventures were now providing jobs, valuable pay slips in rural areas which had never before seen an industrial job, or for that matter, a pay packet. It must have seemed that now we were overcoming the obstacles. We were on our way to achieving the reward of our own talents and labours, to which independence had been the key. But now the year was 1929. And on a Black Friday, the Irish dream was to suffer a blow from afar as crashing storm clouds gathered over a narrow little street in New York where the sun never shines. Wall Street.
And you can watch
in creating a remarkable vision that lay largely hidden from the rest of the world. Recently uncovered, they reveal a unique record of a faded past.
Day collection of photographs, stills and film is the most important collection that has actually come down to us from a period dating from about 1865 up until the 1970s. It's a national treasure.
The Day collection is most significant because it is a record of Cork City throughout 3 generations. All of these things which we now have lost, an Ireland which has now disappeared. This is really a legacy for the future.
It really is the life of the city, seen by people who clearly loved the city and who were loved and respected by the people around them. If somebody mentions the Day family, what I remember is this rather gorgeous-looking, maybe now old-fashioned shop right in the middle of Patrick Street, the centre of the main shopping area.
Established in 1828, the family-owned shop expanded to add children's toys and sports goods to its existing leather business.
The Robert Day business is essentially a saddlery business, supplying the local gentry, supplying the needs of the army, the RIC and everything else. It's a successful, respectable business.
The Days belonged to the merchant prince class, who were a very important, if slightly invisible behind the scenes kind of presence in Cork. They were able to keep their tradespeople for, generations, which bears testimony to the fact that they were respected and even loved as employers.
But it was to be for the fruits of their hobby, photography, rather than for their business acumen, that the Days were to be best remembered. The Days were also owners of the famous Menard shovel mills a few miles outside the city. Here, generations of craftsmen produced more than 100 varieties of shovels for Irish farmers. Established in 1790 by the Quaker Abraham Beale, the mills used the water in the steep natural valley of the Blarney River to power their machinery.
4 mills were situated on it which used the water one after the other, which were operated by 3 families which for generations stayed there.
But by the middle of the 20th century, the mills and the Days' business interests had passed their peak. Menard closed in the early 1960s, and with Alec Day's retirement in 1963, the premises on Patrick Street made way for a new era with one of Cork's first super